I think because we're starting a new group and there are maybe one or two, three people who have not participated in this particular framework in the past, maybe we'll just go around and say a brief where we are, where we're coming from, perhaps faith tradition, just so we get an idea of who and what we're talking about. I'll start with you, Michael, in case you leave it out, Michael makes guitars. Not only you're a doctor, if I remember correctly, but you make guitars.
Yeah, that's correct. I retired from pediatrics a couple of years ago. I'm living in Fredericksburg, Texas. I retired from pediatrics a couple of years ago and started making classical guitars. So for the past 3 years, that's what I've been doing, that's really a joy to do, definitely enjoying my retirement. I grew up Roman Catholic. I have when we moved to Fredericksburg, we joined St. Barnabas Episcopal Church, where Stephen was the rector, and since then I've kind of dabbled back and forth between the Catholic Church and St. Barnabas, and my of interest, my son Gordon, my oldest son Gordon, and his wife are expecting a baby, which should be delivered by next Wednesday. They say if they don't, she doesn't do this on her own, they're going to take matters into their own hands on Wednesday. So we're very excited about that.
Wonderful. B'Shah Tova, may the baby come exactly at the right moment.
And I have another son in Nashville, North Carolina, who's getting married in September. So it's a big year for us.
That's great. Well, good to see you again.
Thank you.
And Wayne, if you just a brief introduction.
Sure. I'm Wayne Sinclair. I'm a retired attorney, mainly working in a large firm defending doctors and hospitals in malpractice cases. I would tell you there is such a thing. I live in Palm Springs. Occasionally, not often enough, I have lunch with the good rabbi, and I've been with my husband, John, for 32 years.
Thank you. And you are your current tradition is the UCC tradition, correct?
Yeah, I grew up a Lutheran, became a Presbyterian for more than 40 years. And when we came out here, we met a couple of Kevin Johnson and Kevin Lourdes to be UCC members, and he's retired, and we have an interim, and we're starting to look for a permanent one here soon. So
Hey.
if everybody knows any ministers who want to come to Palm Springs.
Okay, thank you. Rita Claire, brief introduction, including some of the faith traditions you have traversed over your long and fruitful life.
Oh my goodness. I live in Palm Springs and have been here for a lot longer than I ever thought I would be. It's 34 years. From San Diego, originally from New York. So my claim to fame is that I have 8 children. So now you know what I've done all my life. I'm definitely retired now from everything. And occasionally I will bake challah, and I do a lot of knitting, a lot of reading. I talk a lot on the phone with my kids because none of them live here, but they're still close enough. At any rate, I thoroughly enjoy our get-togethers. I look forward to it.
Don, please share with us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Donald Ross from Suffield, Connecticut, belonging to the UCC tradition, but really am an interfaith spiritual person. I am a retired liability claim manager. I heard the word medical malpractice and my ears perked up. That's kind of the zone I worked in for a while during my 44 years career in the insurance business. Have 3 children and 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren.
Thanks, Don. And Sue and Sid. You could unmute and
Okay, well, Sid born and grew up in Scranton, PA. He's a yeshiva bacher, and we moved to Palm Springs after he retired first, and then I retired. And when we looked in LA, we couldn't afford anything, so we came out here. We've been here for 20 years. He has a religious background. My parents were socialists, so I got nothing. And I've come to religion extremely late in life. That's it.
Mhm.
and we're glad that you did so, and you're with us. So just to mention that Rita Claire and Sid and Sue and some of the others here are also members of Or Hamidbar, Light in the Desert, our congregation here in Palm Springs. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I'm Richard Jeffrey. I grew up on Long Island, in a Reform synagogue. I was bar mitzvah there. Then kind of stepped away from religion as I dealt with my sexual identity. But then I have an older brother who's very supportive and helpful and who is religious. And so I went to synagogue, I thought, just to be for their sake. And at that I was at Isaiah with a female rabbi and a gay cantor, and I said, something's gone on in Judaism in the 50 years I've been gone, and that got me back. And but when Rabbi David came here, I followed him from Isaiah to Or Midbar, and I've been in Palm Springs for 19 years. I'm a retired production accountant in the film industry. I worked on films and television.
And go ahead, Manny, one of our newer members.
I'm originally from Queens, New York, and I came out to California in 1982. I was brought up Roman Catholic. I had nuns and everything in my grammar school, and in 1989 I converted to Judaism, and I'm very, very glad that I found Or Hamidbar. It's been wonderful.
Nice
Troy.
to meet you.
Troy, you want to give us a short intro?
Yes, sir. My name's Troy Pollard. I live in Southwest Virginia. I have a wonderful wife and daughter that I don't deserve, but God certainly blessed me in every way with it. So I'm grateful for it. I teach mathematics at public schooling, and equally so, I'm blessed with outstanding families and children that I get to teach. So I'm truly grateful to take part in that. In terms of my faith, I don't know if I'm unique in your world, but I'm unique in mine. I have a Christian background, upbringing of for the most part. In recent years, I've grown curious just through reading scripture and such, and many questions have came up, all of which are good and have drawn me closer to God, but not necessarily fitting the mold of the conservative Christian viewpoint that I've been exposed to. Once again, it's been a great journey, but I'm sort of in between, you might say. So I'm not sure what you would call me. I've definitely not converted to Judaism. I've come across the term Noahide, but probably don't fully understand what that means. But at any extent, I'm grateful to take part. About a year ago, I found my Jewish learning and have been taking part in that as opportunities present themselves. And as many others have said there, I'm truly grateful to be able to take part. So thank you for these opportunities. It truly is comforting. So thank you so much.
Great to have you, Troy. Megan.
I'm Megan Feather. I recently, I have no pictures on the wall yet, relocated from Southern California, Carlsbad to Raleigh, North Carolina, way across the country. I am semi-retired, a lot of retired psychotherapist. I was thinking I converted to Judaism in 1989, like Manny said, but I think it was 98. I have to check. I was brought up, I don't know, just really with life. And I came to Judaism because it was so interesting. And I came to Or Hamidbar because I love Rabbi David and all his teachings. Now that I'm very far away, but I'm across the street from the shul that I had an adult B'nai Mitzvah in, which is very fun because I can just walk across the street to everything. But they are one of those that have 2.5-hour Shabbat morning services. Gets tired, yeah.
Thank you. So clarification for those that were not raised in the Jewish tradition, the word adult b'nai mitzvah, instead of a bar or bat mitzvah at age 13 or 12 for girls in traditional communities, b'nai is the plural, and many people have begun referring it to b'nai so they don't have to single out a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah gender issues, but also it's an adult thing. People that did not experience it as a young, as an adolescent, go through it as adults, and that's common. The other thing that was mentioned were a yeshiva bocher. Sid was a yeshiva bocher, which means that he was a yeshiva boy. He was raised in the Orthodox tradition, going to a very strict Orthodox school, and a lot of that is in his background, and we often gain from his insights, from his memories of that study. And Rita Claire mentioned that she bakes challah sometimes. Maybe that's known to everybody, but that's the bread for Shabbat, very often braided. Harold, few words, please.
I'm sweating here in Palm Springs, and I'm retired. I worked as a speech language pathologist for the VA. And anyway, in terms of faith tradition, I'm from a mixed marriage. My father was Jewish, my mother was English, and was what is known in England as C of E, Church of England, which is Anglican Episcopalian over here. So we immigrated to this country when I was 6, and I was in fact raised in the faith tradition of my mother, Episcopalianism, and it wasn't until much, much later that I decided to embrace Judaism. So that's my more of my faith tradition now. I do have to say about Episcopalian, I've heard some of the language changes. I grew up with the old Anglican prayers, and I do have to say I miss the language. I love the language of the old Anglican prayers, and it sounds a little bit different to my ears since it's been so long since I've heard it. If I return, like what the rabbi gives a talk every once in a while at the Episcopal Church here, and I'll attend to listen to his service. And when I hear the current prayers, they just sound different. They're not bad or good. I'm not saying it's not judgmental. I mean, I understand that they modernize the language, but I do love the language, the old language of the older prayers.
Thank you. Thanks, Harold. Steve.
Hi, my name is Steve Carson. I grew up in Philadelphia, where I served a 3-year apprenticeship at a French bakery and became a French pastry chef. And in 6 years after that, in 1982, I moved out to Los Angeles and I opened up a bakery cafe, and where I, in 2019, retired. I moved out to Palm Springs 5 years ago, almost in June. And I joined a choir, and that's where I grew up Catholic, but I got in touch with the United Methodist Church. Through the United Methodist Church, I met Rabbi David. The universe, I like being able to hear all different opinions. I'm very grateful to all the Jewish people in my life. I grew up working for Jewish caterers in Philadelphia, and also when I first moved to Los Angeles, I worked for Jewish caterers. And even when I was building my kitchen and my bakery, I worked for the largest Jewish caterer in Los Angeles. So I'm grateful for everything that's happened to me, and I enjoy the choir so much, and I serve lunch to the homeless on Saturdays. So that's what I do out here in my choir.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm guessing Steve's made more challah in his life than you have, Rita Claire. That would be my guess. Dan.
Maybe.
Hi, I'm Dan Stark. I live in Joshua Tree, by way of northern New Jersey, New York City, Massachusetts, and quarter century in Orange County before moving up here in 24 years ago. I have synagogue upbringing of education in New Jersey, returned to an active involvement with Judaism in my mid-30s, which is in the 1980s, and have benefited since then by a number of challenging and inspiring teachers, not the least of which is Rabbi Lazar for about the past 7 or 8 years. I'm been a college math teacher, a software engineer, and a radio reporter. I'm retired now.
Thank you. And Malka.
Hello, everyone. My name is Malka. I grew up Jewish. My parents, grandparents, great grandparents, as far back as their memory goes, we were all Jewish. I actually have 2 master's degrees from Jewish Theological Seminary, and I have a master's degree from Colgate Rochester Divinity School. At one point, I thought I wanted to really specialize in intertestamental studies, so that's why I went to Colgate Divinity School. I spent 5 years as a rabbi in residence at a large Baptist church in Brooklyn. I spent a few years as a dean and then as a professor at a yeshiva that's basically catered to Jews of the African diaspora. I received Shemikah from the organization that I was born into, and I met Rabbi David just by surfing the net, and I came across the site, and I actually am so fascinated with him and appreciate everything that he does. And I wish I could find a rabbi in Maryland that was just like him. And I've said that to him, Rabbi, you have to move to Maryland.
Well, thank you, Malka. And this is, we should put Sasha sitting across the room from me. And if she doesn't want to come to the screen, I don't think, but she could say some negative things about me as well, which might balance things. It's got a little bit lopsided here, I don't feel. And look at the person who makes so much of what we do come together in Or Hamidbar, but also spanning across these different organizations and geographical locations, is Madalena Garza, and she's next to St. John there, and she also has a halo. If you look closely, you can see a halo around her head as well. If you could say a few words about yourself, Madalena.
Sure. Well, I'm the tech person for Hamidbar, so I'll be the one opening the classes, the Zoom meetings, and just I'll add my email to the reminder with the study sheet so that you can contact me if you need any help joining. And I'm part of the Or Hamidbar group here in Palm Springs, and I love it. I grew up Catholic, but was never really I never really connected with Catholicism, and converted, I think 7 years ago, to Judaism. And it has been a long process and a lot of learning throughout. But yes, that's it. I'm glad to join the group.
Thank you. And it's Madalena's artwork, graphic artwork, web design, everything. It's more than just hosting the Zoom call. So in a second, I'll hand it over to Stephen. Look at this was worthwhile. First of all, we don't do this often, and different people will join, and maybe we'll have them introduce themselves in the weeks to come. But this is I love the word embroidery. Embroidery. I had an organization in Israel for 17 years called Rikma, which means embroidery. It also stood for spiritual community leadership training. But the fact that it's embroidery is that we're all different threads with different with different colors, with different textures, and we're being woven together. We're weaving ourselves together on this text, on this ancient text, in order to understand not only each other, but to understand ourselves as well. And these threads from the embroidery, they're almost all traditions. I happen to know somebody here was also part of the Jehovah's Witness tradition for many years in their lives, and others here as well. From time to time, we hear of people with past from the Pentecostal church, and this is just quite a gamut. So we're bringing to the table here, to the Zoom screen, all these different traditions, and to me that's rich, that's wonderful, that's humanity, and that helps me as an individual understand who God is, because we're created in the image of God. So Stephen, I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, David. And for those of you like Manny, we've not met, and I just wanted to. I grew up in Houston. I in the Episcopal Church, which I left and explored kind of in my quest. I studied Greek and dived pretty deep into the intertestamental, but also the first century New Testament culture. And Malka, I studied at JTS for a year and other places. I served the Episcopal Church in Fredericksburg in the 90s. And that's my wife, Gwen, and I are moving back there after all these past years. And we have 3 kids. So great pleasure to be here. Also, David, I know that the notice went out late, but Steve Byrne is in Cambodia and he'll be joining. He was going to try to join here now, but he'll be here next week. Frank Richardson, a few others from our study in the past 2 years. So look forward to being enriched by the whole team. So David asked me to just situate this Gospel of John, and I don't want to belabor it or bog down, but I do think a lot of us who grew up in a Christian tradition on this Zoom, and those who haven't, it's a fact. As David and I were talking, so we did the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles for our launch a couple of years ago. We finished Isaiah this past year, and now John. We thought maybe Job, maybe but I think John, especially. I think John, which has been the source of major divisions between Christians and Jews in Western culture from the beginning, is in fact a Jewish document written by Jews. And so that's the case David and I want to try to explore. And it's totally different from the other Gospels in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the so-called synoptic Gospels. They're more focused on the historical narrative. Mark, many scholars say, was written first and before the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. And so if Mark was around 60, that gives us our most austere collection of these early Jesus stories. But keep in mind, Jesus lived in the first part of the first century. And this is like, Mark is the next generation. And in the meantime, they've been collecting these oral traditions, these stories. They're writing on pieces of papyri, and then they finally begin to collect these stories together in the genre of the gospel. Scholars also believe Matthew and Luke were written after the temple was destroyed in, let's say, 80, let's just say 80 Common Era, Matthew before Luke. And so they all kind of draw from the same core of historical narratives. And then the Gospel of John comes that third generation, like 90 to 100, right, to the turn into the next century. And ironically, the Gospel of John is very misunderstood, just at the very least. And yet you'll find Christians who are rooted in the idea of John Locke and the Enlightenment, that there is this objective reality that with our scientific methods, we can discern, the historical facts of the matter. And so to that end, you'll find Christians who want to try and weave together all four Gospels to give us a composite picture of Jesus that really distorts the picture. Each one has their own specific voice, and to then try to bring them all together, especially when you bring John in, which is so other. And it's so other that many scholars in the church from the earliest days, from Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, all these early so-called church fathers, especially through the Middle Ages, they used John's gospel to create the dogma of the Trinity, of Jesus as God. It was thought to be a very Hellenistic document because it does feel so, the language, the Greek is so much more simple and spare than you'll find in the complicated Greek of the Synoptic Gospels. But also, there are those sections in the Gospel of John that talk about the Jews, and the Jews as the evil ones. And so these proof texts in really 3 key chapters has been the source of just a catastrophic amount of violence against the Jewish communities from the beginning, from the beginning, but through the Crusades and the ghettoizing of Jews in every European city, and then the eventual Shoah, and where it all kind of finally exploded in the Holocaust. And John takes a lot of that blame, and the language of the Jews who are hostile to Christ, who is seen as, the Messiah, God, has been, it's been the source of division. But I hope that as we dive in, we'll get a deeper sense that no, this is actually a very Jewish document. And hopefully we can help make that case, and we'll begin to see it hopefully as a text that can actually bring us together instead of split us apart. That's just my intro to the Gospel of John. A lot of folks thought maybe it came out of the Gnostic communities because it's so cryptic in how it speaks. The words that come out of Jesus just sometimes don't sound very human or real. The miracle stories in the Gospel of John, which we'll soon see, are called signs. And they're unlike the miracle stories in the Synoptic Gospels and beg to be interpreted on their own. So it's going to be a fun ride. I'm looking forward to, going through this with y'all. And if there's any questions about that general overview, please speak up. Yeah, Don.
Yeah, take us back to the time after Christ was crucified and the number of elements and societies that was in the Jewish community. And the question is, which part of the Jewish community was this supposedly written for? I mean, I hear words like Jews, Hebrews, Israelites. So I'm not quite sure to whom this gospel was addressed.
Great question, Don. And I'll just say briefly, most scholars put it in Asia Minor around Ephesus, which was of course a Roman colony. I mean a Roman state. But Ephesus, as third largest city in the ancient world, is where legend or the story has it where John, the beloved disciple of Jesus, took Mary and lived out their days, and that a community formed around John. As in the earliest days, they were all Jewish Christians who then offered the covenant by grace to Gentiles, to Greeks, or to members of other ethnic groups. And as the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans, the Jews were the root, the deep olive root, and the Gentiles were grafted on to the olive shoot as branches, and were welcomed by grace into the covenant life and people. But what happened as we all, those of us who went through the book of Acts, we saw early on the movement of the Christian church, which wasn't even called Christian in its earliest days. They were seen as a sect within Judaism. They were, the Jewish Christians, or the Jews who believed in the Nazarene, and they were often called the followers of the way, or the Nazareans, or they weren't called Christians until later in Antioch, and that was by their detractors. But here's the point that I wanted to say, Don, is that the Jewish Christian mission to the outsider, to the other, to the Gentiles, was predicated on the idea that God had acted in a new way through Jesus of Nazareth, who is the Messiah, but along the lines of the suffering servant, not the conquering Davidic king. And so the whole idea of Messiah gets reinterpreted in Jesus in a whole radical new way. Some Jews, of course, immediately push back on that, but others who embraced or believed in Jesus, they still believed that the law needs to be observed in every way. In other words, yes, it's great that these Gentiles want to be part of our community and that they believe in Jesus, but they have to be circumcised. They have to become Jewish. That's the covenant, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. And so this early group of Jewish Christians who insisted on circumcision and on following the law as good Jews would do, they were Paul and others within the Jewish community, in the Jewish Christian community, said, no, circumcision is of the heart, and you don't have to be literally circumcised. And so Paul reinterpreted that particular law in a way that caused a lot of the mainstream Jews in the synagogues, or in those communities in the Roman colonies, where Jews would meet and congregate, they saw Paul as anti-Jewish, as he's blaspheming our tradition. And so they would continually harass Paul and run him out of town. So there was this early split over the question of the covenant, the law, what it means to be Messiah, the, you know, God's truth and all that goes with that. So in short, by the time of after the temple had been destroyed, and now the Jewish people don't have a place for liturgical sacrificial life. They, you know, some scholars say they went to Yavnia on the Mediterranean coast near Tel Aviv today, and that they began to reconstitute and slowly but surely moved into the rabbinical traditions, the Talmud that comes much later out of Babylon and Jerusalem. And yet the animosity between the Jewish Christians who thought circumcision unnecessary and who didn't follow all the law, they were considered heretics by a lot of Jews in the mainstream. And I don't know, scholars dispute this, but my old professor, Shaye Cohen at Jewish Theological Seminary, you know, he cast a lot of doubt on this this document where within the Jewish, because the Christians were now pushing Jews out and persecuting Jews, just as Jews were persecuting Christians, it boiled up, and there became this curse against those who believe in Jesus as Messiah, and that curse was supposedly repeated often, and that they became obsessive, and suddenly the blasphemy and cursing Jesus, who was God, incited more violence against Jews by now the church, which is mostly Gentile. You know, so that split between the Jewish Christian community is now Jews and Gentiles. And I, you know, I think it's a tragedy. And John has been part of that, because as we'll see, the Jews who killed Jesus in the Gospel of John, who are so demonized, basically, it was an inter-Jewish community split. And so ironically, the Jews who are writing the Gospel of John are condemning Jews, the Jews. Well, those are their kindred. But now that ideological split is so wide that, like in any community that breaks off from another, just as we kind of see it in our own culture right now, once you start demonizing the other, then the rest is history. And I'm hopeful that John will give us an antidote to that, or that we can at least interpret it in a way that makes that case. Don, what do you think about that?
I don't know enough about the makeup of the Jewish society or Hebrew society at the time. I understand the tension that arose as we studied Acts of the Apostles. But I could see where it is a Jewish document.
And I think all of that will be borne out as we get into the text itself.
Yeah. A lot of people interpret the selection that we have in our source sheet as really the pre-existing Christ. It's like another, you know, another story that follows the line of birth in the physical world, that this was also the story of the birth of Jesus in terms of the spiritual world. The preface to the gospel. So there are multiple interpretations, I think, of this.
And I'm just giving you one account, right?
Yeah, and I don't know which. Honestly, I'm not competent.
It gets complicated. David, what are you?
Yeah, so why don't we jump into the text just to piggyback on what Stephen said? This tension, stress polemic between different groups. Often the way you deal with that, and this is the time for me to say what I say since October 7th, that we dedicate this study to peace and to understanding between different peoples, especially in light of the war in Gaza right now and on the West Bank. People will do the same thing that I think is being done here. They'll say, let's go back to the beginning. And of course, the beginning is different for everybody, isn't it? Right? Where do you start the story? And so wisely, I think, from a theological point of view, from a literary point of view, from a philosophical point of view, the author here, or the editor, the redactor, whoever it might be, says, let's go back to the beginning, folks. You want to know what's happening really with this? Let's go to the beginning, and I mean the beginning, says the author here. So I'm going to suggest that we jump into the text with the time we have. Maybe we can finish this, and we can look at some of the other texts that I brought next time. We won't get to them today. So Dawn, would you like to do that, because you are, if I remember correctly, you're a deacon as well. If you would do us the honors by reading this text. If you could read the whole thing.
Okay. This is a prologue to the Gospel according to John. In the beginning was a Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light, the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me." From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is the only Son, himself God, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known.
It's pretty clear, right? It's very simple, the whole text, I think. It's really not much to say about it, right? For those who are new, I'm joking. So Stephen, help us out with our pedagogy here, or with our methodology. What's the best way for us to approach this very complex text?
Well, it clearly links, as you give us in the other texts that follow. it clearly is rooted in the creation story of Genesis. In the arche, in the beginning, was the Logos, from which we get logic and dialogue and all the rest. But in the beginning was, as in Hebrew, the dabar, the word that comes to the prophets, right? We just finished Isaiah, and the word of the Lord came to Isaiah. We also have Moses going up to meet with God in Exodus 20, and as it says, God spoke these words. And also remember, God speaks the creation into being. God said, let there be, let there be. So the davar, the word here, is very Hebrew. And I think what happened in part is that it uses the word logos, which is a very prominent word in Greek philosophy. Heraclitus, Aristotle, the Stoics all saw the word, the logos, as the principle of the cosmos. It's the inherent heart of all the cosmos, and especially with the Stoic philosophers, the logos was kind of our access to the divine, to God out there becomes God in here through that logos. And so also I would want to say, as you go down to where and the word became flesh and lived among us, that word literally is skene, for tent. And the implication, I think, for the first century Jewish reader is the tabernacle. And you remember the words that God spoke and gave in the desert. Now, as wanderers, they build the tabernacle, the tent, and the Ark of the Covenant. God's word is literally with them. And the Shekinah glory cloud that leads them is the presence of God. So God's presence is everywhere in that understanding. And so when this literally says, and the Logos became sark, it became meat. It's not soma, it's not body, it became meat. And it tabernacled literally among us, right? That the first century Jewish reader just gets that. We have been diverted thinking that this is basically the deepest inspiration to talk about Jesus's divinity and Jesus's messianic work. But as you can see, they're basically retelling the Jewish story in this prologue in a way that now moves to the evolution of the understanding of God. And as scholars, and especially one scholar, John Spong, in his book on John's Gospel, understands that the writer of this gospel draws on Jewish mysticism, and David can talk more to that later. But in short, I wanted to say that in this prologue, we've got three layers, or we've got multiple layers. You've got the Jesus story in its historical setting. Then you've got the retelling and the traditions that emerge. But what you have finally in the Gospel of John, and let's say it's 100 Common Era, and that's 70 years after the historical life of Jesus. A lot of what the Gospel of John is doing, it's got two layers. It's got the historical layer where the story is told from that point of view, but it's also got the layer of their present life in that century, in the 90s or 100. And so they're reinterpreting their life together using the Jesus story, but it's evolved. And now what they're saying is something very singular and different than the Synoptic Gospel said. But whether or not this was the proof text for the divinity of Christ, as early church fathers tried to make it, is up for debate. David, that's just my riff. What do you think?
So the first, I think the most important point for me here is that the background for this text is, as you described, is a vacuum, a huge traumatic vacuum to the Jewish people by extent as well. Whoever thought the temple was central to their faith tradition, which is ancient Israelite tradition, not yet perhaps called Judaism, but still those same people, there's a vacuum. There's a crack. It's traumatic. One of the things that Jews who grew up in the liberal traditions of Reform, Reconstructionist, and even conservative movement to a lesser degree, don't have an emphasis on the destruction of the temple commemoration, not just one day in the year, the 9th of Av, which was reportedly the day that both the first and the second temple were destroyed, along with all sorts of other calamities. But in general, the traditional way of building a house is to leave a square cubit unfinished on the wall, in one of the walls, not to paint it, not to plaster it. Breaking the glass, that's a later interpretation, but still that's the most popular interpretation. Breaking a glass at a wedding. All sorts of things during the year, not just that one fast day in the summer, but other fast days, the 17th of Tammuz, the 10th of Tevet, are all surround around the destruction of the temple, as well as so much of Jewish liturgy mentions this. So the vacuum that was which left room for the rabbis, who were the Pharisees mostly, who created the rabbinic sage tradition of the Mishnah and the Talmud, this is happening in that same vacuum. And in order to deal with the vacuum, as I said, the author goes back to the very beginning. And not just the beginning as far as logos is concerned, and logo, as Steve mentioned, that it's mentioned. We'll see in a second. Well, we won't see today. Perhaps, you know what? Flip the page for just a second. Now, let's look first. Let's just quickly do Genesis. Manny, if you'd read for us number 1, Genesis 1 through the beginning of the creation story.
When God began to create others, in the beginning God created heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from others, the Spirit of God sweeping over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, a first day.
I think many of us know this text, but just to emphasize, the light was the first step of creation. As Steve mentioned, God speaking. I want to get, next time, I'd like to lead perhaps with the passage from Proverbs, which I have until this, and from Job, which Job I had dealt with in the past, but not Proverbs. But I want to skip, if you would, to number 5, something from around the 1st century. This is the one tractate in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, the earliest level of the Mishnah. It doesn't have a later Talmudic explanation of it. It's actually about law. It's about ethics. It's wisdom. It's rabbinic wisdom literature, and that's number 5 in the Tractate of Avot. And it's an anonymous saying. With 10 utterances, the world was created. What does he mean, 10 utterances? There were 10 times in the creation story, if you look at it, in which, in the whole creation story, in which God says, let there be. God says, why don't we make human beings, etc. With 10 utterances, the world was created. And what does that teach? What does this teach? For surely it could have been created with one utterance, with God saying one word. But this was in order to punish the wicked who destroy the world that was created with 10 utterances, and to give good reward to the righteous who maintain the world that was created with 10 utterances. 10 being a typological number. I'm not using typological perhaps in the traditional American New Christian way. Typological as one of these kind of, it's a mnemonical device to remember things. But this emphasis of the word, that when I mentioned in our beginning comments that we bring together the different aspects of God's identity, of God's, our possible understanding of God, because we're created in the image of God. To be created in the image of God, I think first and foremost is to talk, is to speak. And along with that comes the wisdom aspect of logos, or logos is I was taught, I studied Greek in Hebrew, and we called it logos. And so that's kind of the background, I think, in which I this very, very preliminary beginning of this conversation could go. I think, Don, there's something you need? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, if you substituted the word Torah for the word in our reading, you get a whole different kind of slant on this. That was the only comment.
Great. And I think next week we'll talk about Torah as law, as nomos, and what might the difference between nomos and logos, and perhaps maybe one or two other things. But this idea of going back to the beginning and the possibilities of what this is. Spong is going to be, Bishop Spong's writings are certainly going to be in the background. I am not finished with it yet. I enjoy reading it very much. I sometimes question his academic conclusions, at least from my own background, but that's good as well. And so this is great. I'm so happy we've started this way. If you've got any comments, please know you can always write to me and Steve's. Many of you do. In between classes, we'll try to answer if we can. Sometimes we get to it in the class itself. And we look forward to seeing you next week as well. Stephen, I think you're muted. Steve, you're muted.
Irenaeus, one of the early thinkers in the church, he understood the Trinity, the Father, the two arms of God are wisdom and logos, Sophia and logos, Holy Spirit and Son, which, you know, I think we'll have some fun next week opening those up a bit.
All right then.
God
bless you, and may our words, may our logoi go up to God, and may God hear our pleas. Thank you.
Amen.